This is the podcast about digital fatalism. Today I'm talking to Thomas Blomseth Christiansen, whose work I came across at an exhibition curated by FutureEverything in collaboration with Science Gallery London. And it was called AI, Who is Looking After Me? And the way that this exhibition was framed was that it was looking at who holds the power in AI systems, who distributes the benefits, and who bears the burden of the existing systems. So this was the context that I came across Thomas's work in. He's part of Totti Labs in Denmark and is a contributor to the Quantified Self community. So this is an international community who are makers and users of self-tracking tools and the proponents of the idea that you can know yourself through numbers or pursue a kind of self-knowledge through numbers. I wanted to talk to him because I thought he might have some different perspectives on digital fatalism and what it means to be determined by your data or by the interpretation of your data, and to discuss issues to do with data ownership and data gathering practices. So I start by asking Thomas what the phrase digital fatalism means to him.
Yes, so for me, like the associations I get from digital fatalism is that like the data, they are out there and you don't know really how much data there is and what it's saying about you. And then in some sense, it's determining your life. And you have very little agency in the outcomes of what's happening because it's out there and some decisions are made and inferences are made and then your life is guided by that with very little intervention on your own part. That concept of the datafication, of course, I've seen it being used by different scholars that are looking at what we're doing, for instance, in the Quantified Self movement. And to me, like the data in itself isn't the most like important part of it. The data are more a means to an end. And I think that might be a bit different than how it's perceived by many others. As I see the data, they come out of a process of trying to figure something out or you want to know something. And data are input in that process of figuring stuff out. Of course, that can be yourself figuring stuff out using self-tracking, for instance. But of course, there are other actors in society that also have interest in knowing stuff about you. And I think that's the part of it that's been much more emphasized than the perhaps more niche part that I've been working on, which is like, how can you use data in a productive way to answer your own questions? And especially when you have questions where there are no general answers out there in the health domain. There's general knowledge in biomedicine, for instance, but we each have our own things when it comes to health that are much more situated, much more local, much more personal, where this kind of generalized knowledge doesn't really provide the answers. And that's where collecting your own data to answer your own questions can kind of bridge the gap between your situation and some of that generalized knowledge. And you might even generate some new kind of knowledge in and around yourself, something that's never been documented before, even in kind of like science that has a more generalized aim. So that's where I see data. I see it more in that process of figuring stuff out, making reasoning about your situation. As I said earlier, it's a means to an end. It's not like the thing in itself. But of course, then it has taken a life of its own, like because there are some big commercial actors, particularly like nation-state actors and so on, organizations that want to know stuff about us. And they come from the other angle. They come also from that more generalized way of looking at things and putting people into boxes, potentially.
So what you're saying is like, we need to consider who wants to know about us, because the things that corporate and commercial actors want to know about us are going to be very different, and their reasons for wanting to know those things are going to be very different. They're going to be asking a lot of very different questions to the things that we want to know about ourselves.
When it comes to the more commercial angle, for instance, on self-tracking, but also data generally, what you can achieve with gathering big data about a lot of people potentially also has been oversold. When you're aiming for that kind of generalized knowledge, it's oftentimes it takes a long time to gather the data. And then in a lot of instances, I think what we've seen is like what you can infer from that data. It might kind of meager outcomes even, but it's just the discourse is that like if you can gather a lot of data, you can get a lot of insights.
And maybe it's because I think data is quite seductive in a way that it's like it presents the evidence. It gives us something to cling on to.
Yeah, and that it comes with a implicit objectivity where it's kind of like the further you get from very specific questions in and around your own life to these more general questions, more and more of the context is kind of lost. So each data point, the color is kind of washed out in some sense. And that's also why you need the further you get, the more generalized you want to go, you need much more data. For more than a decade, there's been this idea, some people say, like, we have all the data. But if you start working on self-tracking as we've been doing, you find out that no, we don't have all the data at all. If you go into very specific aspects of your own personal life or some of the stuff we're doing in a clinical setting, it's like there's so many details that idea that we have all the data and we have like a complete datafication of ourselves, that's a total illusion. That there's so many more aspects to reality that we haven't covered, like even a fraction of it. You might even say that there's an infinite many aspects to reality, and that therefore we can't capture all the data. That's simply impossible from an epistemological view. So it's always about like which questions do we want to answer.
And could you talk a little bit about your like specific projects that you've worked on, and like what were the materials, what were the processes, what was the motivations behind making these?
I started myself on doing self-tracking more than 15 years ago, and actually before smartphones. So it was really improvised because I had some allergies and eczema that I didn't get good solution for in the medical system. At that time, I was working with the process improvement in software organizations and working a lot with that process improvement mindset. I was like, well, I can use that on myself then. If I can't get any solutions from my doctor, then I'll have to figure out some stuff myself. So I started asking these questions: how could I characterize my allergies, and also getting in, searching online for ideas about other ways of looking at it, and then I just started like using an own feature phone with a camera, like snapping pictures of my food using some mind maps to try and capture notes and stuff. And that's where the process kind of started. And then for some years, I was part of developing a smartphone app that took a different kind of perspective than most other smartphone apps 15 years ago, which was we wanted to capture people's subjective experience of different phenomena. At that time, the idea that you could do passive sensing and kind of measure people from the outside was getting going. You saw like the early Fitbits and other activity trackers. But from our own experience with these complex health conditions, we saw that there were a lot of things you actually couldn't capture by just measuring from the outside. There are a lot of symptoms around fatigue and stuff that, you experience it on the inside. You need this subjective point of view, and you need your own consciousness as part of the instrument, as the entity that's observing what's going on. And then you can create technology that can make it much easier to capture these observations that you're making yourself. So I worked on that for some years and gathered a lot of experience around how you could potentially use this in a clinical setting also. But it was clear that in biomedicine, they're not ready for this kind of approach at all. Like taking people's individual in the moment experience of symptoms at face value and using that in a clinical process, they were not ready for that.
When I came across Thomas's work, I was handed a printout with this quote from him, which I'm going to read out because I think it gives a really specific insight into his perspectives on how agency relates to data. It didn't come up in our conversation, but here it is framed as epistemic agency. So he says, you have your own epistemic agency. You don't have to ask for permission from anyone or any institution to figure stuff out. I think that's the core of autonomy. You get some new instrumentation, and that means that you can engage with yourself in new ways. I don't see that as something that is soaking up all the agency. I see it the other way around. It's more like musical instruments, where my musical expression is made possible by the clarinet. It's not like the clarinet owns it.
And then, 9 years ago, I had to give up on that project and started another project together with Jacob E. Larsen that I'm still collaborating with. And Jacob, he had also been thinking about these things you couldn't capture with these other instruments. And he had this insight that, and he's an human computer interaction researcher, this insight that perhaps there was something beyond the smartphone. Yeah, you can make observations of your own subjective experience by pulling out a smartphone we had this setup where you can configure individual for each person what they are tracking, which was also kind of different at that time. But his insight was that there was something beyond the smartphone, which might be an instrument that was so simple that it only has one button. So that's what we've been developing. So it's just a new kind of instrument where you can press the button and then it records the duration of your button press and the exact time. That means that you can increase the frequency of making observations even further from the smartphone, because you don't have to pull out a phone. Even like compared to smartwatches, you don't have to look at it. You can carry it in your pocket, you can carry it on your wrist, you can carry it around your neck. And then when you have a sensation, for instance, personally, I've been tracking itching in my nose. For many years, I've been tracking all my sneezes. I've been using that instrument for tracking the precursors to sneezing, because I got on top of my allergies to an extent that I don't sneeze that much. So I wanted to track the precursor for sneezing. So it's an instrument where you can track 100 to 150 observations a day with no hassle. Right now, it's just a small 3D printed plastic kind of box with some electronics that we have gotten developed ourselves. We're kind of forced into creating our own hardware because we couldn't buy anything like that lived up to the specifications that we had for this kind of instrument. There's some things around the interaction where the problem with the smartphone is you have to pull it out of your pocket. We did some back of the envelope calculations about my own self-tracking with the smartphone app, and I've been using like 500 to 600 hours just pulling the phone out of the pocket and unlocking it, open the app, pressing the right button, and so on. So it takes a lot of time. And then there are other things about the smartphone, which is it's a multi-purpose device, which especially if you're using it in a clinical setting, as we're doing it now with people with PTSD, then perhaps you don't want that interference, a distraction from all the other stuff that's going on the smartphone. And also for people with PTSD and other mental health disorders, for instance, like they might kind of get lost. Like if they had to pull out the phone, they wouldn't be able to do it before they got into, for instance, hyperarousal, as people do with PTSD. So it has to be extremely fast. And the thing is, with one button tracker, you can just, if you're carrying it in your pocket, it becomes almost automatic. You kind of reach for just that point and you press the button and you can do less than a second. And then also it doesn't have a visual interface, which is also you can operate it without looking at it. And also importantly, other people can't necessarily determine that you're doing the tracking. So you can do it in social situations without disrupting the whole situation. And then also there's something about having an instrument that has a single purpose. We found out that if for smartphones, they have all these different purposes and you get distracted, as I mentioned earlier, but it's also not clear really for the user, what is this thing about? It's about some social media, it's about messages, it's about a lot of different stuff, taking photos, all that. But having an instrument where it's only one purpose is also a way of tapping into your own intention for tracking. You're carrying this instrument because you want some answers for some very specific questions. So that instrument embodies also your intention and your questions. Then there is the data dimension. Because Jacob and we come out of the Quantified Self community, at least the current version, it's not connected to the cloud. We want to put the user in total control of their own data. So it has a USB connection. So it's, if you're using clinically, then the patient would bring the instrument into a clinical session and they would connect it to the clinician's computer as like a ritual. I'm giving you access to the data I've collected. Been experiencing the Quantified Self community for many years is this kind of paradox where you have these commercial vendors that are collecting all these data, but it's actually for you as a user or a tinkerer, it's actually difficult to get access to the data. They might not provide good APIs for accessing data, but as you said, like then they're sharing that data with a lot of different other commercial actors. But actually, you as the individual that from where the data originates, you might have a hard time accessing that data. So that's also why we have these principles about the user being able to access their own data and being control their own data. For some, there's some historical reasons for why and commercial reasons for why the setup is as it is in in many other instances. But as we see, they're kind of contingent. Like you could build the technology differently if you wanted to.
And with your own research, like, has that affected how optimistic or pessimistic you are in terms of being able to challenge specific moments of digital fatalism? I'm just thinking what we were talking about just before of like with other apps, if it just gives you like the answer, but it doesn't give like the breakdown of how that answer was even reached, then it's very difficult to challenge, like, or to refuse what that answer is.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even in the sense that it might be implicit that a lot of the user interfaces for self-training services, the questions are kind of built into what they have built, but they're not explicit about constraints or limitations of that. For my own projects, also, like I have had to access APIs to get data out from some of these services, and then write my own scripts to be able to merge data from different services to be able to answer my own questions, because the commercial vendors, they kind of lock you in to a certain set of questions, and behind that set of questions there's a certain way of looking at the domain, and oftentimes like the individual questions, they're kind of falling in the gaps between what they have decided beforehand. So you could imagine a much more like fluid way of interaction with your data based on what are your personal questions. In a group in and around the Quantified Self, we're writing a book about personal science, as we call it, which is kind of like the way of boiling what the practices of the Quantified Self community down to something more understandable, actionable for a broader range of people. With that initiative, we kind of hope that there are more people out there that are interested in using data for answering their own questions. One of the limitations has been people's ability to write software in some sense, because I've been using my professional skills as a software developer for doing it. But like just within the last year, we've seen some things where you can use the large language models, the LLMs, for data analysis, and especially also generating a code that might be able to help people, where they can actually build their own custom like data analysis apps or scripts and stuff that would have taken, we can see some of the stuff that would have taken us days to write just 2 years ago, you can do in hours now. So that might also be a way of the professionals could even like help people with some prompts or something that then could enable them to generate their own scripts that can analyze the data. So there's actually potential there where the LLMs might result in some kind of a more democratic access, so to speak, to reasoning about your own data.
Like, do you think this situation that we're in now, is it inevitable? I guess what I mean by that is kind of, do you see it as like we've always tracked ourselves in different ways, like before smartphones, before digital technology? Like, is this a logical development of how digital technology has progressed? Or like, is it something like inevitable about digital technology that encourages us to track ourselves?
Think that part of it is probably inevitable, that the facilities and opportunities that comes with the digital technology, of course we would start using that about ourselves. However, how it's built or what commercial forces that are at play, I think that's much more contingent. That's where there's still a much larger design space than we have seen actualized. And that's hopefully going in a direction where people can see more of the opportunities. 10 years ago, some of the stuff I was tracking, other people in the Quantified Self community were tracking, seemed odd. Like it was just some nerds doing some very odd stuff. How could that possibly be useful, right? But now it's mainstream that it could make sense for you to wear some kind of activity tracker and look at the number of steps a day or something. There has been a progression in the understanding of the value of these data. The question is, can go from there to this more widespread kind of democratic, much more low situated use of data. I think it won't happen if we don't try, or else these other forces, the commercial forces, they will probably still be pulling in a different direction.
This podcast has been supported by Northern Bridge Consortium, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council.